Welcome back to Witch Hunt. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
And I'm Sarah Jack. Today we're exploring the dynamics of coercive control with Kacey Baker, host of the Cult Vault podcast.
Kacey has interviewed hundreds of survivors, sharing the stories of life in cults and high-control groups. What started as a lockdown project has evolved into a vital platform for survivor voices and advocacy.
Through her work on the Cult Vault and her recent master's degree in the psychology of coercive control, Kacey brings unique insights into how coercive control manifests across different contexts, from cults to domestic relationships and beyond.
She's joining us to discuss ethical approaches to sharing survivor stories, current legislation around coercive control, and how understanding these dynamics can help combat abuse in all its forms.
Our conversation with Kacey touches on serious topics, including psychological abuse and trauma. Listener discretion is advised.
Here's our conversation with Kacey Baker of the Cult Vault.
Welcome to Witch Hunt, Kacey Baker of the Cult Vault podcast. We connected after hearing your presentation at a SARA National Working Group meeting because of how our subject matter overlaps with yours.
Thank you both so much for having me on your podcast today. It's great to sit down and catch up with both of you, Sarah and Josh.
As host of the high-performing podcast Cult Vault, you have created a vital platform where survivors shared their firsthand experiences of cults and high-control groups. Tell us about your work amplifying these important stories.
Well, it's been a bit of a roller coaster, really. I have found myself in this work by accident. I think that's often the case when you kind of connect with individuals like we have, and you start to have conversations about how people ended up doing such niche and specific work.
Yay.
Well, that was a little pleasant introduction.
Yeah.
That was great.
She's learning how to open her stair gate, so I think that's what it was kind of creepy, the slow
So was that when I loved it.
Yeah.
Like, be waiting for it.
Yeah. So I found myself doing this work by accident. I'm sure anybody that has heard me talk about this will know exactly what I'm going to say because it feels like scripted at this point. I was on maternity leave with our firstborn, who was 4 months old at the time that the first lockdown for COVID started over here in England. And I had a partner who was working 12-hour night shifts, and we were really struggling to find something to keep me sane in between, sleep deprivation and cluster breastfeeding and just kind of navigating parenthood as first-time parents in the middle of a nationwide and global, at that point, wide lockdown where we were not able to have, external support. And I realized that I just needed something to keep myself stimulated, and that turned out to be podcasting. I tried a number of different things, found an old room mic, and decided that I was going to start a podcast. And even if nobody listened, at least I will have spent some of what free time I had, either when baby was sleeping or when partner was home, doing something that felt like you could see the results at the end of it. Some people were learning how to do the splits, and I was just like, wow, you can actually see how much you've progressed with learning something new. So I started a podcast about cults. I didn't expect anybody to listen. But after the first few episodes of covering things like Jonestown and the Branch Davidians, and asking the question on whether, ISKCON and the Hare Krishnas, is that a cult? I had a few people reach out to me and explain that they themselves had been in cults and were looking to share their experiences. So I started interviewing survivors, and from there it really just snowballed into something unplanned, unprecedented, educational. So 5 years on, I think we're close to something like 400 episodes on the podcast. And I realized that I had been learning so much along the way that I wanted to try and quantify academically some of the stuff that I had kind of self-educated myself on. And so tomorrow I graduate with a master's in the psychology of coercive control. And that's why I'm recording this evening with my curlers in. It's a very Scouse thing, which is like Liverpool, England. It's very common and typical for a woman to have her curls in before a night out. And I am up in Liverpool in England. So I feel more comfortable with my curlers in Liverpool than I do with them out.
That's awesome. Congratulations. Do we need to define cult? Where do the boundaries fall around that?
I think that every person you ask, how do you define the term cult, will define it slightly differently. Even different dictionaries have different definitions for the term cult. If you ask people in mainstream Christianity, they are likely to say that anything that doesn't conform to mainstream Christianity is a cult. So things like Seventh-day Adventism is a cult, or and then all of the splinters that come from that, because the Branch Davidians came from the Seventh-day Adventists, which came from mainstream Christianity. And there's so many different religious sects and factions that you can kind of look at that have had that same journey. But Christian Scientists, they would be labeled a cult movement by people in mainstream Christianity. And if you were to speak to cult experts, a lot of cult experts would say that there is a charismatic authoritarian leader who commands totalistic control of individuals underneath them, and demands that people obey a certain belief system that is not reflected in mainstream society, typically would be seen as quite radical or extreme, especially if those same belief systems were identified in mainstream religions outside of Christianity, like Islam, for example, which I think is a really interesting thing to look at on its own, how the rhetoric and the dogma and the theology is pretty much translatable between the major religious texts, but the way that propaganda works and the way that extremism works, we are quick to identify Islamic extremists, but we aren't able to look at the FLDS or Christian nationalism or Dominion theology and say, oh, actually, hang on, if you're talking about the one and true religion and supreme human race that all comes down to a theological basis, then that's all very similar. So in terms of defining the term cult, it's really tricky. There's even a group of people that are often referred to as cult apologists in the cult education and academic and awareness space that are defenders of cults and will use terminology like new religious movement. And instead of labeling a group as a cult, even if that group or organizational movement fits the framework of identifiable markers that make up what we recognize to be a cult, they are oftentimes paid by these groups to speak on national, international stages and defend the movement. Sometimes in the court of law, these people are also employed by cults to disagree with the cult expert that's been brought in to testify why a group is a cult, and then the cult apologist will be brought up by the opposing side to say, actually, this is not a cult for all of these reasons. So then massive divides in the cult education awareness space and how you would define a cult or how you would even summarize the definition. My really long-winded response is exactly what I said at the start. Everybody you ask will define a cult slightly differently, I think.
That's really great. That is so much of it mirrors a lot of what we see with witchcraft, in which there's just all of this space and room for those definitions.
Yeah. I think what's really tricky is that I think you have a much harder battle with the term witch because people can positively identify with that word and it can also be pejorative, whereas the word cult, I think, is universally pejorative, especially after the 70s and 80s. Before that, I think that word was used in a pejorative sense, but now it is mostly related to mass murders and suicides. And that's how the word reached mainstream pejorative kind of contextualization. Whereas witch, some people will take pride in identifying with that term. So I think you've got a harder job in trying to work between the two.
It is hard to separate between different definitions of things. And like you said about cults, it depends on who's defining it, how they're going to define the word. It's relative to everybody's own perspective. And I think witchcraft is similar. Your perspective might be witchcraft is this positive thing, or your perspective might be witchcraft is this fearful thing. And how has your understanding of cult dynamics changed since you began the podcast?
My gosh, it's been another whole roller coaster. Like this specific part of the journey has been probably the most illuminating for me in a personal sense. I was very much somebody that was what I would call an unethical true crime content consumer. I would listen to really untactful, non-compassionate true crime documentaries and podcasts. And I would be really detached from the information that I was listening to. I would just stick something on to go for a walk or drive to work. And I didn't really ever consider the fact that these stories were real people who had families and loved ones. And I didn't ever really realize that most of the episode content was based around the perpetrator or the serial killer or the cult leader. It was only after I started speaking to cult survivors that my whole kind of perception shifted on not just true crime content consuming and how to really try to develop my own more ethical content in terms of transparency and consent and personal psychoeducation. So I would understand the experiences that the people I was speaking with had been through, at least to some extent. I haven't been in a cult, so I'll never really fully understand. And everybody's experience is different. So even if I had been in a cult, my experience would still be different to those who had been in different environments or even the same environment. And all of these things I just had never considered until I started the podcast itself and speaking with survivors. And I used to definitely be one of these people who would say, oh, if I was in an abusive relationship, like, why didn't they just leave? Like, I would just leave. Or who joins a cult? I would never join a cult. Or only stupid people join cults. And these really unhelpful misconceptions that the general wider public have about cults and coercive control in terms of abuse outside of cultic abuse or domestic abuse. Like, wherever you find coercive control, if it's in the workplace, if it's in the family, if it's in your yoga group or your church or your knitting group, or even in just some of the friendship groups that you have, the dog walking group that you go to, wherever you find coercive control, I really did have this skewed victim blaming mentality. And I'm not ashamed to talk about it because I think it shows that anybody can go on this learning journey and everybody can have this shift. in perception and education and understanding and compassion. But it does make me a bit uncomfortable to relive those really ignorant moments that I used to have.
I have like 2 questions now. I got to decide which one wins, but let's talk about coercive control. What do we need to know about it, or what really developed around it for you with your research?
I was having so many conversations with people about abuse. And usually it would come from me talking about the work that I do on the podcast, speaking with cult survivors, and then talking to somebody that, like at CrimeCon, for example, a fellow podcaster who is talking to victims of domestic violence or domestic abuse. And we would have these conversations where we'd be talking about the same thing. I'd be saying, well, the cult leader does this. And then my friend Lucy, who has a podcast called You Don't Own Me, she would be saying, oh, but that's what the domestic abuser does. That's what the perpetrator does. That's what the, violent spouse or the psychologically abusive spouse does. And I was thinking, oh my gosh, there's no way that this is just happening in all of these different pockets and it's not all connected somehow. But my brain wasn't going that far. I was speaking with people who had been in the military, and they were talking about their basic training and how coercive it was. And I was thinking, wow, that's just what cult leaders do. That's just the way that cults are set up. And I just wasn't realizing that all of these different contexts or environments where coercive control was taking place were all linked with this common thread. And it was only after I heard the term coercive control and I looked down at the definition, an act or a pattern of acts of assault, threats, humiliation, and intimidation with an aim to harm, punish, frighten, and control somebody. And I was like, wow, that could be the definition of cults, but it's also the definition of workplace abuse or sports abuse or human trafficking and modern slavery, the type of control that's exerted in that environment. And it was only when I came across the term coercive control that I was like, that's it. That's the thread that ties all of these contexts and environments together. And it was like a light bulb moment. And I was so relieved. But then I thought, what do I do with this now? I can start to invite survivors of other forms of, or other contexts of abuse, not other forms, because as we've just explained, it's all coercive and controlling behavior. But I could start to ask human trafficking survivors, or people that have experienced workplace abuse, or people that have experienced female genital mutilation or breast flattening, or any of these types of coercive procedures and abuses, onto the podcast to share their experiences so we could continue to kind of like unify these contexts somehow. And then I came across the master's course at Salford University, the psychology of coercive control. And it was being pitched as the only course of its kind, which worried me at first. Some people were like, wow, it's the only course of its kind. And I was like, that's really dodgy to me, though, because one of Lifton's 8 criteria is mystical manipulation, where they would say, wow, join our group. We have the one true word. We know the one true answer to this question. We have this thing and it's one of a kind. So I was a bit dubious, because if anybody's presenting themselves in that way, I think it's important to try and be as questioning and critical as possible. But I was also coming across moments of people saying, oh, you're a cult expert. And I'd be like, I'm not a cult expert. I'm like maybe a like 4 person's version of a cult expert. I'm just over here like, I can answer a few questions. And the more it happened and the more uncomfortable I felt, the more I thought maybe if I could quantify academically everything that I'd learned over the last 5 years, I might feel a bit more comfortable with people saying she's a cult expert, or can you come and be an expert witness in this federal trial that we have coming up? So I went through the Salford University course. I was very thankful to get a place on the psychology course because I have an arts undergraduate background. So I didn't know if I'd be eligible for a psychology master's. But yeah, 1 year on and we're done. We're finished with it. And I was so relieved that it's over. It was a lot of hard work. But yes, I am now Kacey Baker, MSc.
Well done. And I want to add that one of the things I love about podcasting is you get some multicultural experiences. And your story with your hair today is one of those. I love that. It's like unexpected. But when you talked about being so comfortable in the community, and I'm like, I just learned about that culture there a little bit more. So anyway.
Great. Yeah. If you ever come over to England and you visit Liverpool, you'll see exactly what I mean. There's a pajama culture over here as well. If you go out in your curlers and your pajamas, like people know you be getting married in the morning,
That's
that's
awesome.
serious. Like I'm ready for a night out aesthetic. Yeah, it's great. It's not something that I would have done when I lived down south. But now that I've lived up here in the north in this particular area for a long time, it's great. I do. I'm very lucky and fortunate to have the opportunity to speak with people from all around the world. I've spoken with people from the Philippines, Mexico, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. I speak more with people over in America than I do people from here in England, but I'm so lucky with the diversity of guests that are willing to come and share their experiences on the podcast. It's an incredible education for me, and I receive so many emails and comments on YouTube and reviews on Apple Podcasts of just people thanking the survivors for coming onto the podcast to share their experiences, and how validating that is for other survivors who are tuning into the podcast. So it's multifaceted in the impact that it has, and the testimonies that each brave person comes forward to tell moments of their deepest vulnerabilities and most difficult moments in their lives. And it's hopefully a healing experience more than a re-traumatizing experience, because that's something that I do try and avoid at all costs with each guest that comes onto the show.
It requires a special touch, doesn't it?
I think so. I think the more that I can learn and the more compassionate I can be, hopefully the more supportive and reassuring the process of being on the podcast is. But that's why, as you two will both know, there is a pre-interview process that I try to go through with each participant before we record. It's not something that you would ever want to just sit down and say, let's chat, without any type of preparation. But there is always the risk that reharm will happen, that re-traumatization will happen. As much as we try to avoid that, anytime you sit down to talk about the experiences that you've had in your life that have been the most difficult, sometimes that will just stay with you. I have that when I sit down with my friends and we talk about things that happened from our childhood, and then all of a sudden we're like not feeling okay for a few days, which is absolutely nothing like the types of conversations that I'm having on the podcast. But in terms of a spectrum, I think we all know how it feels sometimes to open up with our vulnerabilities, and how sometimes we can shut the door and sometimes we can't.
Yeah. One of the things that we have heard about in India is with witchcraft accusation support, or those mostly women, but not always, who have been attacked. Some of the communities, there unfortunately are so many that they're coming together to work through it and talking about their stories. They'll do beautiful public art walls or other art dramatizations together to make it a acceptable discussion to help educate. And so I think all of this is so delicate, and I'm always incredibly thankful for these brave individuals who are able, but it's not necessarily, it's not obviously bravery isn't what makes it okay for you to talk about it. I don't know why some are able to, but those stories that are able to be told or shared do bring hope to others. But definitely avoiding reharm is incredibly important. And only each individual can decide that for themselves.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's key as well, to make sure that there's never any expectation or pressure on an individual to share their experiences. I think that's where I'm very lucky to have, this is a two-sided coin. Absolutely. I would love to never have another interview to do again. Imagine if we were like, oh, all the stories have been told. There's no more stories of cults or coercive control to share. Of course, that's unlikely to happen in the near future, because we're still really building this momentum and this platform of education and understanding and legislation, which plays a massive role in tackling psychological abuse. But in terms of the podcast itself, I don't really reach out to individuals and ask if they'd be willing to come onto the show. A lot of the time, it's people contacting me. And I think that that's been a really important part of the process, because I don't feel like I'm putting pressure on individuals by reaching out and contacting them. And even if that was the case, I think in those situations, if you're just very transparent and you say, there's absolutely no expectation here, a lot of the time it would be word of mouth, or you see someone post like in the cults subreddit, for example. So you're already thinking, oh, well, this person has shared part of their story online. Maybe they'd be willing to share their story in a recording capacity. And that's where it's important to offer guests the opportunity to remain anonymous, semi-anonymous, using pseudonyms or first names only, or changing the spelling of the first name, or not recording video, not using landmarks or specific identifying information in an episode, and just keeping things kind of generic is just some of the ways that you can protect a person's identity when they come on to record an episode. But yeah, I think it's very much on an individual basis. And even if people aren't sharing their stories publicly, you never know the impact that the podcast is having to those who don't come forward and say, this episode changed my life, or I was going to sign up to this group and I'm so glad I listened to this episode before I paid them all of this money, or whatever type of feedback that comes through. If you are only hearing from a certain percentage of people, I often wonder how many people you don't hear from, and the impact that it's having with those that don't or can't reach out.
You mentioned the legislative aspect of it, and coercive control has been recognized in the UK as a form of abuse. What is the impact of that legislation?
We were very lucky in 2015 to have the Serious Crime Act introduce Section 76 into law. So Section 76 of the Serious Crime Act criminalizes coercive and controlling behavior in a domestic capacity. So it means that in intimate partnerships and family environments, coercive control can be prosecuted, but it's very hard, first of all, to prove and then to prosecute. It's really tough. The nature of psychological abuse means that there are no physical marks. There are typically no scars. There may not be an electronic trail of abusive messages on WhatsApp or Facebook. There may not be voicemails. There may not be recordings or video clips. In cases where there are, that can be really handy in prosecuting cases of coercive and controlling behavior. But sometimes it's very much character, witnesses, testimonies, and my word against yours almost. And in those cases, it can be often that narcissistic and psychopathic or very controlling individuals find legal loopholes to exploit, not only in order to continue abusing and controlling the person that they are facing in court, or the person that they have received charges for. It can also mean that the person that has been abused and victimized and subjugated is often painted as the person that is the abuser. So it's I think prosecutors have a very tricky job. I think police officers and frontline workers do as well in terms of identifying coercive control. Years ago, police officers would show up on people's doorsteps for domestic issues, and they would say, oh, this is a woman could have a black eye, or a man could be absolutely visibly shaking in fear because of his wife, or children could obviously be used as a pawn because parents have split up and they're trying to use the kids as weapons in this feud. Whatever it looks like in terms of intimate partner violence or domestic abuse or familial abuse, police officers would often say this is a domestic issue, and then they would leave it at that. We have had a lot of different pieces of legislation that recognize domestic abuse, domestic violence, and now coercive and controlling behavior, which means that there's statutory funding, which means that there's statutory training, which means that non-governmental organizations are now being trained on what coercive control looks like, the signs to look out for, where do you send people if you're worried, or how do you approach somebody that you're concerned may be being coerced and abused through coercive and controlling behavior. The only problem is it doesn't expand to groups. So when we're talking about cults, we can't actually use the legislation on a group-wide basis. So we can't go into a kingdom hall where we know Jehovah's Witnesses are protecting sexual predators in a specific region because they do internal investigations and they have the final word and they believe that they are above the law and all of these different things. Just as an example to pull out of the air, there isn't a way that we can use the Section 76 England and Wales law at the moment because it doesn't extend to group settings. There is a huge lobbying effort going on at the moment with the Family Survival Trust, which is a UK-based charity that supports survivors of cults and coercive control and those impacted as well. So family members who may have lost somebody to a cult or to a coercively controlling environment, along with the National Working Group of Spiritual and Ritual Abuse, which is the same organization who I presented for the other day at their first spiritual and ritual abuse conference, which was incredible. So the legislation has definitely made it more recognizable, but there's still such a long way to go. We have such a long way to go in just, having a nationwide understanding of coercive control. And that is without considering the rest of the world, where there are some other countries that have criminalized coercive control and implemented their own legislation. Scotland has a great piece of legislation in their Domestic Abuse Act. Australia recently, just this year in July, I believe, in New South Wales, introduced legislation that criminalizes coercive control. There's a few states in America that criminalize coercive control. I'm told that those states aren't really enacting much on those particular pieces of law, but they're there. These are the first steps to having a worldwide understanding of coercion. I am hopeful that other countries will continue to follow suit. We will continue to tweak and amend the legislation as we did with the Domestic Abuse Act in 2021. And what will come with that is more tweaks and more changes and more countries following suit and so on and so forth until we have a better understanding and grip and a better way to combat coercive control overall.
And the National Working Group and this conference, I'm so eager to see what's next. I know this conference was focused on victim stories, but you also have this strong legal component as far as expertise and experience, and as you mentioned, lobbying. I'd love to hear anything out of that conference, or something that you think
Yeah.
it's important for listeners to understand about?
Was all of the things. And all of the emotions and all of the things. It was exciting and it was nerve-wracking and it was exhausting and it was frustrating and it was heartbreaking and it was motivating, inspiring, invigorating. I honestly felt like I'd been hit by a train by the end of this conference. And then the next day I woke up and felt like I'd been drinking for a week straight and had the worst hangover of my life. My body and my brain felt absolutely battered. But I also can't explain how refreshing it was. Like, and I'd never felt this before, going into a room where everybody understands that coercive control happens across contexts. I feel like I've been shouting this for the last however many years on my little soapbox, and people are like, oh, actually, that makes sense, doesn't it? If you think about it that way. But in this room, everybody already knew. You didn't have to have that preamble. You didn't have to have that conversation. Everybody already knew. Everybody was on board. Everybody wants this legislation amended. It was just like we could really get down to brass tacks. We could really get down to business and talk about how deep this thing goes and how much change we can make and where we can go next and what we can do, because we didn't have to get all of those kind of initial conversations out the way. And I think it's really important and it's still inspiring to have those conversations, but it's not often I'll find myself in a room where everybody is already at the same place. It was just amazing. The survivors sharing their stories was just equal parts harrowing and just showing us exactly why this work is so important. And oftentimes when you speak, so that there were people that were from domestic violence charities, and they were like, yes, we already know all of this stuff about cults. They weren't 3 years ago me having this conversation with my friend Lucy where I'm like, oh my gosh, our work's the same. Like, your domestic abuser and this cult leader, like, they're the same thing. Everybody was so past that point. It was incredible. Jordan and the team, Sam and Tox, they put together this incredible conference that I felt really, really thankful and privileged and honored to be a part of, and to share my master's research findings towards the end of the day in this lineup. And it was the first conference as well. So I do feel like it's going to continue getting bigger and better every year. I think I might just need to like book myself into a spa the next day and just kind of like, come down from all of it, because it was a lot.
Talking about the various contexts that coercive control appears in, we've even learned about it in a witchcraft context where people manipulate somebody's fear of witchcraft and coerce them into human trafficking or other situations.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's really important, Josh, to highlight, when I talk about how coercive control is present across contexts, it also intersects the same way that my work intersects with every other person that was at this conference. You will find typically in a cult that there will be people that are abusive in the home, and also people that are, and those same people will be abused in the cult. And some of those people in the cult may then be trafficked to a different state or a different country. So when we talk about coercive control happening in all of these contexts, it definitely intersects and overlaps as well. And I think that's really important to point out, Josh. We heard a story from one survivor who did share her experiences of being trafficked to a different country, having her passport taken away, or at least attempts to try and remove her passport. And then she would have candles laid outside of her door. She was forced to drink blood. And then she was told that if she didn't follow any of the rules that she was given to the letter, the blood would kill her from the inside out. And this, to people that have not grown up in environments where this type of witchcraft is used to scare people or to control people, that all might sound a bit ludicrous and over the top to us. But for people that have grown up in these belief systems, where if you come outside and there's a chicken on your doorstep, that means something very significant in your culture, in your community, in your ancestry. So it was really important to, made aware of these different types of ritualistic abuse and these different types of witchcraft, because in the conversation that we had when we were talking about the Salem witch trials, that representation and presentation of witchcraft was very different to the ones that we heard about in the conference. And I think, again, it just shows you like you can learn as much as you can learn independently, but without working with other people, you're never really going to get all the other puzzle pieces. And that's so important when it comes to educating yourself on the lengths that this topic goes. Just talking about witchcraft, and I was like, wow, I just didn't realize like the extent of it in our conversation. And then that went even further when I was at this conference. So yeah, it was, my mind was like, whoa, we need to like decompress.
I've had that experience when, as this has progressed, a lot of what you have shared about your journey of coming to understand and to grips and perspective, I've really experienced that in this whole witch hunt context. So you're going to be at CrimeCon next year, and how will you bring the advocacy aspect into your connecting?
I think that's really important to try and hold on to different types of events and conferences. Of course, the spiritual and ritual abuse conference was survivor focused, and it was a very warm, informed, it was a very smart room. I felt a bit intimidated getting up. The chief crown prosecutor was there, and I was like, oh. And there are also incredibly accomplished and intelligent people at CrimeCon, the best in their field in terms of retired detectives, senior investigating officers, forensic psychologists, psychoanalysts. There's lots of very learned people with lots of life experience and work experience under their belt that come to talk at CrimeCon. Very lucky to have been offered a platform a few times at CrimeCon UK. They're sponsored by True Crime. They have a huge platform and it grows every year, and they have amazing guests and survivors and advocates. They have fierce family members come forward and speak about how they've managed to get law changed and how they've managed to go into Parliament and talk with politicians and say, this can never happen again. And those are some of the most heartbreaking and inspiring conversations and talks you'll ever hear. I often, when I'm invited onto the stage to talk, will not go up on my own. I will ask somebody to come and talk with me, typically a cult survivor who can talk to the subject of cults, coercive control, and their personal experiences. I think that's the heart of the podcast. So if I get a chance to speak in front of a live audience, I still try and bring that dynamic. There's so much that I could say about cults, but when it really comes down to what it feels like to be either born and raised or recruited into a cult or high control group, to experience the level of manipulation and coercion inside that group, and then to rebuild your life afterwards, which is so important and often so overlooked in so many pieces of media to do with cults and coercive control. I could never do that justice. So I've been really lucky that some amazing guests have joined me at CrimeCon. I was joined by Elgin Strait, who has a podcast called Falling Out Pod, and he is a survivor of the Unification Church. And he is a fierce, outspoken voice when it comes to trying to rid the world of the Moonies. I've been joined by one of the world's leading experts in extremism and authoritarianism, which was John Atack, he's known as like the Scientology encyclopedia, the most educated person on the topic of Scientology. And he has a book called A Piece of Blue Sky, or Let's Sell Them a Piece of Blue Sky, which is the updated version. And he's just like, honestly, a book of facts. Everything he reels off is a date and a place and a person and an anecdote and a quote. And He is amazing, and I'm very lucky to have had him take me under his wing and mentor me somewhat in how to navigate this space. So I've been really lucky with CrimeCon to continue receiving invitations back to the event and to represent cults, because I'm usually the only person there that is talking about cults. I'm like the little resident cult person. They call me the resident cult expert, but again, I'm like, maybe one day. And also just to continue giving or helping to give a platform for survivors to share their stories as well in capacities that they feel comfortable with.
Is there anything else you wanted to speak to before we let you go?
Well, I've said a lot. I've said so much. I've just rambled on, really. Thank you for letting me ramble on. Just to keep learning, keep reading, keep educating yourself on subjects that you find interesting. Doesn't have to be cults and coercive control. That just happens to be what got me. I never expected to find myself in a position where I would be an ally and I would be advocating for people and I would be lobbying for legislative change to such a capacity that I would get myself a master's and kind of retrain in a whole new career and area just out of an interest in a particular subject. And that subject happened to be cults. It's incredible what you can do when you are just interested in something. You don't have to be like trying to take on the world or trying to carry the world on your shoulders or anything like that. But you never know who you might be helping in just taking an interest in something and trying to understand it a little better. And I think that if we all just did that a little bit more, and we tried to approach that with an open mind and a bit of compassion, we could be changing our own lives and maybe other people's as well. So yeah, just take an interest in something and then, take a little bit more.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Josh. Thank you for all the work that you do as well and for letting me come and just blah, 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 blah on your show.
Thank you.
Mary Bingham is back with Minute with Mary.
Margot Burns reminded me that one of the best published sources in which she made a huge contribution was not a primary source, but the best secondary source. Wait, what? That's right. Records of the Salem Witch Hunt is a top-notch secondary source. It is as close to a published primary source available to us, better than the Salem Witch Papers, which were found to be published with some transcription errors. The team that traveled to locate all of the known documents pertaining to the Salem witch trials for records of the Salem Witch Hunt, who transcribed these original documents from the original handwriting, were the best of the best. The reason it's not considered a primary source? Because the reader cannot see the original handwriting. Another great source is this series. Unlike the records of the Salem Witch Hunt, these court documents listed in these publications, which are 9 volumes in total, do not include every single piece of information for every case. Please send me an email if you'd like to know how to find an original court record of Essex County in the original court recorder's handwriting, so most of the complete story of the case in which you are interested can be presented to you. My email is barry.bingham@endwitchhunts.org. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary.
And Sarah has End Witch Hunts news.
End Witch Hunts news. Historic justice within reach. Maryland and Massachusetts considered generations overdue witch trial exonerations. Following Connecticut's landmark 2023 resolution HJ34, a resolution concerning certain witchcraft convictions in colonial Connecticut, acknowledging witch trial victims, Maryland and Massachusetts are poised to take similar historic steps. Maryland's House Joint Resolution 2 seeks justice for alleged witches Rebecca Fowler and Mal Dyer, while Massachusetts' HG 3054 aims to exonerate Boston's witch trial victims Margaret Jones, Elizabeth Kendall, Alice Lake, Ann Hibbins, and Goody Glover. The momentum is building, but these bills need public support to advance through committee and reach full legislative votes. These victims, our neighbors from centuries past, can no longer speak for themselves. We must be their voice. You are part of that voice. Join our community advocacy efforts. Take action now by signing the petitions. Sign the Massachusetts petition at change.org/witch trials. And also sign the Maryland petition at change.org/MD witch trials. Send an email of support to your delegate if you live in Maryland or Massachusetts. Connecticut's successful resolution, which passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, shows what's possible. These new initiatives recognize that witch hunts extended beyond Salem, affecting innocent people across multiple colonies, a pattern of persecution that continues globally today. For more information on modern witchcraft allegations, visit endwitchhunts.org, our nonprofit. For guidance on contacting your delegate or getting involved, visit our website. Links to Connecticut's public testimony records are in the show notes and are a great guide to express your own support for the Maryland and Massachusetts efforts. Thank you for using your voice to break the silence and help securing long overdue justice for these innocent victims. Finally, but not least, join us at Connecticut's Old State House on February 1st at 1 p.m. for our Connecticut Witch Trials Remembrance event, remembering the innocent victims of Connecticut's witch trials. This afternoon of reflection and action will honor Connecticut's witch trial victims through a dramatic reading, a remembrance ceremony, and a community discussion about the history and the path forward to a monument. Distinguished speakers will share insights about Connecticut's successful resolution, and Josh and I will be there in person as the event's MCs. Reserve your spot today on eventbrite.com with a free ticket.
Thank you, Sarah.
You're welcome.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Witch Hunt.
Spend time with us again next week.
Have a great today and a beautiful tomorrow.